She looked at him like he was nothing, just another poor stranger asking for help. Her eyes were cold, distant, but what she didn't know was that the man standing in front of her was her own son. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The city of Chicago had seen stories like his before, but none quite like this. On a rain-soaked evening in late October, Daniel Hayes stood across the street from a towering glass building that reflected everything he once dreamed of and everything he had lost. People rushed past him, umbrellas clashing against the wind, headlights streaking across wet pavement, but Daniel didn't move. He had spent years imagining this exact moment, years rehearsing what he would say, how he would stand, how he would feel. But nothing prepared him for the silence pressing against his chest as he stared at the place where his past and present were about to collide. Daniel wasn't always a stranger to warmth. He was born in a quiet suburb outside of Boston, where life once felt simple and predictable. His earliest memories were filled with laughter, bedtime stories, and a mother who seemed to hold the world together with nothing but her presence. Her name was Margaret Hayes, a woman known for her intelligence and ambition, admired by those around her and trusted by everyone she met. To Daniel, she was more than that. She was home. But everything changed when ambition grew louder than responsibility. When Daniel was just 7 years old, Margaret made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. She left. No long explanation, no final embrace, no promise to return. Just a quiet disappearance that turned into years of unanswered questions. At first, Daniel believed she would come back. Children often hold on to hope longer than they should, and Daniel was no different. He would sit by the window every evening, watching cars pass, convincing himself that one of them would stop, that one of them would bring her back. Days turned into months, months into years, and slowly that hope transformed into something heavier. He was raised by his grandmother for a while, a kind but aging woman who did everything she could to fill the void. But life wasn't easy, and when she passed away, Daniel found himself alone far earlier than anyone should. Foster homes came and went, each one teaching him the same lesson in a different way. People leave. Stability is temporary, and love, when it exists, doesn't always stay. As he grew older, survival became his only focus. School was inconsistent, friendships were rare, and trust became something he avoided entirely. He worked small jobs, slept in places that offered just enough shelter, and learned how to read people before they spoke. But no matter how far he drifted from his past, one question refused to let him go. Why did she leave? It wasn't anger that followed him, at least not at first. It was confusion. A constant search for meaning in something that made no sense to a child who had done nothing wrong. Years later, that question finally found an answer, though not in the way Daniel expected. Through fragments of information, overheard conversations, and a chance encounter with someone who recognized his last name, Daniel discovered that his mother hadn't disappeared into nothing. She had built something, a life, a reputation, a career that placed her among the most respected figures in corporate America. Margaret Hayes was no longer just a name from his past. She was a powerful executive, known for her sharp decisions and her ability to rise above competition. She had everything: success, recognition, influence, everything except the son she left behind. That discovery changed something in Daniel. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly over time. It gave direction to the years he had spent drifting. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want money. What he wanted was something far more difficult to face. He wanted to understand. And so, after years of carrying a past he couldn't escape, Daniel made a decision. He would find her, not as the boy she abandoned, but as the man he had become. Which brings us back to that night in Chicago. The rain hadn't stopped, and neither had the city, but Daniel remained still, holding on to the one thing he had kept all these years. A photograph, worn at the edges, faded by time, but still clear enough to remind him of a moment when everything felt whole. A young mother holding her child, both of them smiling as if nothing could ever come between them. He had carried that photo through every stage of his life, not because it represented what he had, but because it represented what he lost. When Daniel finally stepped forward, crossing the street toward the building, he wasn't just walking into a place filled with strangers. He was stepping into a life that had continued without him. The lobby was bright, polished, filled with people who moved with purpose. Conversations echoed softly, shoes tapped against marble floors, and everything about the environment suggested control and success. Daniel stood out immediately. His clothes told a different story, one of struggle and endurance, one that didn't belong in a place like this. Security noticed him within seconds. They approached cautiously, their tone firm but controlled, asking him what he was doing there, telling him he couldn't stay. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked for her. For a moment there was hesitation, a brief exchange of glances that suggested confusion, but before the situation could escalate, something shifted. The elevator doors opened and she walked out. Margaret Hayes looked exactly like the kind of person the building was designed for. Composed, confident, every detail of her appearance carefully maintained. Time had changed her, but not in a way that made her unrecognizable. If anything, it had sharpened her presence. She moved through the lobby with the ease of someone who belonged, someone who had earned her place. And then, for a brief moment, her eyes met his. Daniel stepped forward slowly, every step carrying the weight of years he couldn't get back. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than he expected. He called out to her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more fragile. A simple attempt to be heard. Margaret paused, turning toward him with a look that was more curious than concerned. Her eyes moved over him quickly, taking in the details, forming a judgment before a single word was exchanged. "I don't give money to strangers," she said, her tone calm but distant, as if she had said it many times before. It wasn't cruel in the way people expect cruelty to be. It was controlled, efficient, final. The kind of response that ends conversations before they begin. Daniel felt something break, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that only he could understand. This wasn't the moment he had imagined. There was no recognition, no hesitation, no sign that she saw anything familiar in him. To her, he was exactly what she said, a stranger. "I'm not here for money," he replied, his voice steady despite everything pressing against him. But she had already turned away, already decided that whatever he had to say wasn't worth her time. And just like that, the distance between them felt greater than it had ever been. For a moment, Daniel considered walking away. It would have been easier. It would have confirmed everything he had learned about life, everything he believed about people leaving and never looking back. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he had carried for most of his life. His hand trembled slightly as he held it out, not as a demand, not as proof, but as a final attempt to bridge a gap that seemed impossible to close. "You left me," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than anything he had said before. "But I never stopped looking for you." Something in his voice made her pause. It wasn't the words alone. It was the certainty behind them, the kind that doesn't come from rehearsed lines but from lived experience. Slowly, she turned back, her eyes drawn to the photograph in his hand. At first, there was confusion. Then, as her gaze lingered, something shifted. Recognition doesn't always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it builds piece by piece until it becomes impossible to ignore. The image in the photograph was older, but the memory it represented was still there, buried beneath years of choices she had never fully confronted. Her expression changed, the composure she carried beginning to fade. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less certain. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The truth was already there, unfolding in front of her. "It's me," he said finally. Silence filled the space between them, heavier than anything that had come before. The lobby, once filled with movement and sound, seemed distant, as if the world had stepped back to make room for a moment neither of them could avoid. The photograph slipped from her hand as the realization settled in. The past she had left behind wasn't gone. It was standing in front of her, asking to be seen. "Daniel," she whispered, his name sounding unfamiliar on her lips after so many years. For the first time, there was no distance in her voice, no control, just emotion she couldn't hold back. She reached out, her hand trembling in a way that mirrored his earlier, but Daniel didn't move. Not because he didn't care, not because he wanted to punish her, but because the years between them couldn't disappear in a single moment. "I thought I lost you," she said, tears forming as the weight of her choices finally surfaced. "I searched, I tried to." "You didn't lose me," Daniel interrupted gently. "You left." The truth didn't need to be louder than that. It didn't need to be repeated or explained. It was simple, direct, and impossible to deny. Outside, the rain continued, steady and unchanging, but inside that building, everything had shifted. A woman who had built a life on control and success was now facing the one thing she had never truly resolved. And a man who had spent years searching for answers was finally standing in front of them. The question that remained wasn't whether the past could be changed. It couldn't. The real question was whether anything could be built from what was left behind. And sometimes, the hardest part of a story isn't the moment of truth. It's what comes after. The rain poured heavily that evening, turning the streets into blurred reflections of passing lights as people rushed to get home, heads down, collars pulled tight against the cold. But Daniel Hayes did not move. He stood there, still and silent, as if the storm had nothing to do with him. His clothes were worn, the fabric thin in places, his shoes barely holding together after years of use that never seemed to end. Yet his eyes told a different story, something deeper than exhaustion, deeper than the life he had been forced to live. There was something rare in them, something that refused to disappear no matter how hard life had tried to take it away. Hope. He stared at the large glass building in front of him, its bright interior glowing against the darkness of the night, a symbol of success, power, and everything that had once been taken from him. It was a place he never thought he would return to, not after all these years, and certainly not like this. Inside that building was Margaret Hayes, the woman who gave birth to him, the woman who walked away without ever looking back, the woman he had spent half his life trying to understand. For a long moment, Daniel remained on that sidewalk, letting the rain soak through him as memories began to surface, not gently, but all at once, like something that had been waiting for this exact moment to return. He remembered the small house they used to live in, the sound of his mother's voice calling him in for dinner, the warmth that once filled spaces that now only existed in his mind. Margaret had not always been distant. There was a time when she was everything a child could rely on, present, attentive, and full of a kind of quiet strength that made the world feel safe. But that version of her slowly disappeared as ambition took hold. Opportunities came, responsibilities grew, and somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. Work became more important, success became necessary, and the life they once shared began to fade into something secondary. Daniel was too young to understand it then. All he knew was that the woman who once stayed by his side began to drift further away, not physically at first, but emotionally, in ways that were harder to explain and even harder to accept. And in that moment, standing face to face with the past and the present colliding in a way neither of them could have predicted, one thing became clear. This was not the end of their story, but whatever came next would have to begin with the truth they could no longer avoid. The rain continued outside, steady and unrelenting, as if the world beyond those glass walls remained unchanged, untouched by what had just taken place. People still hurried through the streets, cars still passed by, and the city carried on with its usual rhythm. But inside that building, in that quiet space where two lives had finally crossed paths again, everything had changed. The distance that once felt impossible to bridge had been confronted, not erased, not resolved, but brought into the light in a way that could no longer be ignored. Margaret Hayes stood there, no longer the composed, untouchable figure she had been just moments before, but a mother facing the weight of her own choices, a woman forced to see the consequences of a decision she had once convinced herself was necessary. Her regret was no longer something hidden beneath years of success and control. It was present, visible in the way she stood, in the way her voice had broken, in the way her hand had reached out only to fall back when she realized how much stood between her and the son she had left behind. For Daniel Hayes, the moment carried a different kind of weight. He was no longer the child waiting by the window, no longer the boy searching for answers in silence. He was standing there as a man who had lived through the absence, who had carried the questions, who had finally found the truth he had been searching for. And yet, even with that truth in front of him, the path forward was not clear. He stood at the edge of something that could not be easily defined, a place between holding on and letting go, between accepting what had happened and deciding what to do with it. Forgiveness was not something that could be given in a moment like this, not something that could be expected or assumed. It required time, understanding, and something deeper than words alone. And Margaret Hayes, for the first time, seemed to understand that. She did not move closer again, did not try to force a connection that had been broken by years of absence. Instead, she remained where she was, facing him, not as the woman who had everything under control, but as someone who had finally come face to face with a truth she could not change. Some wounds never fully heal, no matter how much time passes or how much we try to move forward. They remain, not always visible but always present, shaping the way we see the world and the way we understand ourselves. But sometimes, even after years of silence, even after choices that cannot be undone, the truth finds its way back. Not to erase what happened, not to make everything right, but to give meaning to what was lost, to offer a chance, however uncertain, to face it with honesty. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall outside and the world moved on without pause, Daniel Hayes and Margaret Hayes stood in the same space, bound not just by the past they shared, but by the question of what they would do with it now. As the moment settled into silence and the weight of everything that had been said lingered between them, Daniel Hayes stood still, not as the boy who had once been left behind, but as a man now faced with a choice that carried more meaning than anything he had experienced before. Margaret Hayes remained in front of him, no longer distant, no longer untouchable, but present in a way that made the past impossible to ignore, and the future uncertain in ways neither of them could predict. There were no easy answers waiting for them, no clear resolution that could undo the years that had already passed. Only a question that now extended beyond them, reaching anyone who had ever faced a moment where pain and truth collided. What would you do if you were him? Forgive her or walk away?